When I first arrived in Hawaii, the beauty of the island felt almost surreal. The air was warm and salty. The sun painted the sky with hues of gold and crimson, and the waves crashed against jagged cliffs in a rhythm that seemed eternal. My rental cabin sat on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean, surrounded by dense greenery that felt both inviting and impenetrable. It was the perfect escape, a place to disconnect from the noise of my usual life. On my first day, I met a local guide named Kalani. He was friendly, with a broad smile and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of stories. Over a shared cup of coffee at a roadside shack, he warned me about the Huaka'ipo, the night marchers. He said with a lowered voice, spirits of ancient warriors bound to this land. I must have looked skeptical because he chuckled and shook his head. You mainlanders always think it's just a story. But let me tell you, if you hear the drumming at night, you'll want to remember the rules. Lie face down. Don't look at them. And for God's sake, don't disrespect them. I laughed it off, though his serious tone left an impression. What happens if I break the rules? I asked, half joking. His smile faded. They'll take you with them. And trust me, you don't want to know where. The conversation stuck with me, even as I dismissed it as local folklore meant to spook tourists. Still, there was something about his voice, the way it dipped into a whisper, that made my skin prickle. That night, as I sat on the porch of my cabin, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, I couldn't help but think about Kalani's warning. The world around me felt so alive, so untouched, that it almost made sense that spirits could still roam here. But the rational part of me insisted it was just a story, a cultural relic passed down through generations. I stayed outside longer than I intended, letting the ocean's rhythm lull me into a false sense of peace. But as I finally stood to go inside, a strange feeling washed over me, like I wasn't alone. It was subtle, just a tickle at the edge of my senses, but enough to make me glance over my shoulder. The trees stood still, their dark silhouettes unmoving in the moonlight, and yet the air felt heavy. It was probably just my imagination. At least, that's what I told myself as I locked the door behind me and crawled into bed. The next day passed in a blur of exploration and relaxation. I hiked through lush trails, swam in crystal-clear waters, and marveled at the vibrant life teeming in every corner of the island. By evening, the sun began its descent, painting the sky with fiery hues that reflected on the waves below. As darkness fell, I decided to turn in early, hoping to catch the sunrise from the cliffside. Yet, as I lay in bed, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, an unease began to creep in. The cabin was silent, unnervingly so. Even the usual hum of cicadas seemed absent. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, like the echo of a heartbeat in the distance. A rhythmic thumping, steady and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Waves crashing against the cliffs, an animal rustling in the underbrush. But this sound was neither chaotic nor natural. Drums. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. Kalani's words echoed in my mind. If you hear the drumming at night, you'll want to remember the rules. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew closer, accompanied by another sensation, a faint vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. It was as if the island itself was trembling in anticipation. My pulse quickened as I peeked out the small window, facing the forest. At first, there was nothing but darkness, the trees standing as silent sentinels against the night. But then, through the shadows, I caught a flicker of movement, small, glowing orbs weaving between the trees. Torches. My breath hitched as the faint glow grew brighter, the flames casting elongated shadows that danced eerily through the foliage. The drumming was louder now, echoing in my chest, and with it came a new sound, a low, mournful chant carried by the wind. Panic gripped me. What was I supposed to do? The rules. Lie face down. Don't look. Don't make a sound. But curiosity fought against fear. I wanted to see, to understand what was happening. Surely this was some sort of elaborate prank, a reenactment for tourists, or an odd local tradition. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the glass once more. What I saw chilled me to the bone. A procession of figures emerged from the forest, their forms illuminated by the flickering torchlight. They moved in perfect unison, their faces obscured by shadow. Some carried ancient weapons, others held drums slung across their chests, beating them with an eerie precision. Their heads were crowned with feathered helmets, and their bodies shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as if they weren't entirely solid. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding so loudly I feared they might hear it. This can't be real, I thought. Yet every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. As the chanting grew louder, the air inside the cabin turned thick and oppressive. It was hard to breathe, as though the very presence of the marchers was consuming all the oxygen. I dropped to the floor, lying face down as Kalani had instructed, my mind racing with terror and disbelief. The drumming was deafening now, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest, each beat resonating with a primal energy. The chanting was clearer, their voices a haunting blend of sorrow and rage. And then, just outside the cabin, the footsteps began. I lay on the floor, every muscle in my body tense as the sound of footsteps drew closer. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel path that led to the cabin. I pressed my face against the wooden planks, my breath shallow and controlled, praying I'd go unnoticed. The drumming was deafening now, vibrating through the floorboards and into my chest. Each beat felt like a countdown, an ominous signal marking their approach. The chanting grew louder, their voices low and guttural, weaving a song that seemed ancient and otherworldly. And then they were outside. The vibrations from their steps reverberated through the walls, and I could see faint flickers of torchlight seeping through the cracks in the wooden door. My heart raced, but I kept my head down, eyes squeezed shut, repeating the rules in my mind like a mantra. Don't look, don't move, don't make a sound. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. No chanting, no drumming, only the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The air grew colder, and an unexplainable pressure weighed down on me, as if the very room had shrunk around me. Then came the sound I dreaded most, a hand dragging slowly across the door. It was faint at first, a soft scraping noise that sent chills down my spine. It grew louder, more deliberate, until it sounded as though someone, or something, was clawing at the wood, testing its strength. A low growl followed, deep and guttural, the kind that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. My mind raced with questions. Were they trying to get in? Did they know I was here? The drumming resumed, slower now, more methodical, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a knife. I couldn't understand the words. They were spoken in a language I didn't recognize, ancient and melodic, but the tone was unmistakable, commanding, accusing, and filled with rage. The pressure in the room intensified, and I felt tears sting my eyes. My body was trembling uncontrollably, every fiber screaming for me to run, to get out of there. But I couldn't. I didn't dare. Suddenly, the chanting outside shifted. The voices grew louder, more chaotic, as if the procession had reached some sort of climax. The drumming quickened, a frenzied rhythm that made my chest ache with its intensity. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Even the wind outside had stilled. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear any sound, any indication that they had moved on. And then, as if to mock my relief, a single knock echoed through the cabin. It was deliberate, forceful, and impossible to ignore. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so violently that I was certain whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. I bit down on my lip, forcing myself to stay still, to keep my face pressed against the floor. But the compulsion to look was almost unbearable. The silence that followed each knock felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see, but could feel. And then something shifted. I could hear the faint creak of the wooden steps leading up to the porch. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if whoever was there was testing each step. The door rattled slightly, as though touched by a hand. My mind raced with every terrifying possibility. What if they come inside? What if they already know I'm here? I heard a low hum. No, a chant. Starting again. Barely audible at first. It was the same otherworldly melody as before, but this time it seemed to vibrate within me, resonating deep in my bones. The air in the cabin grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, though I didn't dare lift my head. Suddenly, the floorboards just outside the door groaned under a heavy weight. My breath hitched, and I fought the urge to cry out. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. I could feel it now, a presence so overwhelming it was as if the walls of the cabin were closing in. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating, making it impossible to think clearly. The chanting outside stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from just beyond the door. It wasn't the same language as before. This one was closer, more intimate, like it was meant just for me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the whisper grew louder, angrier, demanding. My body was paralyzed with fear, yet every instinct screamed at me to run. And then the door creaked. It didn't open all the way, just enough to let in a sliver of moonlight. I could see a shadow stretching across the floor, long and distorted, as though the thing casting it wasn't entirely human. The drumming began again, faint and distant at first, then growing louder, like a storm rolling in. It was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, moving around the cabin. The chanting returned, louder this time, more frenzied. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to drown it out, but the sound seemed to come from inside my head now, echoing in my skull. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it all stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, unnatural. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The seconds dragged on, feeling like hours. Finally, I dared to lift my head just enough to glance toward the door. It was shut, as if it had never opened. The shadow was gone, the torchlight outside extinguished. But the room was different. The air was heavier, colder, and the faint smell of burning wood lingered. I felt an inexplicable urge to look out the window, to see if they were really gone. I crawled toward it slowly, every creak of the floorboards beneath me sounding like thunder in the silence. My hands were trembling as I reached the edge of the window and peered out. The forest was dark still, but the path leading away from the cabin was illuminated faintly by the moon. It was empty, or so I thought. At the edge of the clearing, just before the path disappeared into the trees, I saw them, a line of figures, barely visible in the shadows, standing perfectly still. And then, as if they knew I was watching, they turned. They turned as one, their movements eerily synchronized, and for a fleeting moment, I saw them clearly. A line of figures adorned in ancient Hawaiian garments, their faces solemn and painted with streaks of white. Their eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, glowing faintly like embers. Some held torches, their flames flickering unnaturally, while others clutched weapons, spears, clubs, and shields that gleamed in the faint moonlight. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were looking directly at me. I dropped to the floor, my back pressed against the wall beneath the window. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to scream, not to make a sound. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the faint crackling of the torches. Then, I heard the footsteps again, soft at first, then louder as they approached the cabin. It wasn't just a few. It was an entire army marching in unison, their movements shaking the earth beneath me. I closed my eyes tightly, whispering a silent prayer to no one in particular, hoping, begging, that they wouldn't come inside. The drumming started again, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the air and rattling the walls of the cabin. I could feel it in my chest, each beat reverberating like a countdown. Then a voice, deep and commanding, rose above the drumming. It spoke in Hawaiian, a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. I felt compelled to open my eyes, to look again. but every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as if daring me to defy it. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with unspoken threats. For a moment, I thought they were gone, that it was finally over. But then, the door rattled violently, as if struck by something massive. The entire cabin shook, dust falling from the rafters, and I couldn't hold back the scream that tore from my throat. The drumming ceased instantly. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. The door creaked open, just an inch, and a single figure stepped inside. He was taller than the others, his presence filling the room like a shadow come to life. His face was obscured by darkness, but his eyes, those glowing, fiery eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. He raised a hand, pointing at me, and though he said nothing, the message was clear. I wasn't welcome here. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was crushing the air out of my lungs. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I crawled toward the window again, desperate to see if they were truly gone. The clearing was empty. The torches, the figures, the leader, they had vanished without a trace. But as I stared out into the forest, a single drumbeat echoed in the distance, followed by another and another. The sound grew fainter, as if they were retreating, but it didn't stop. Even as dawn broke hours later, the rhythm lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that I had witnessed something I was never meant to see. I packed my things hastily and left the cabin without looking back. The path leading away from the clearing felt different, heavier, darker, as if the forest itself was alive and watching me. I made it to my car just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the treetops. But even now, miles away from that cursed place, I can still hear the drums, and I know they'll never stop.